I don't know if you can find a single Jew in Trenton, inside the borders of Trenton now. Yes, I know of one. Okay.
Beginning in the 19th century, Jewish immigrants that would come to Trenton settled in the Market and Union Street areas of South Trenton. The community grew to be a vibrant and unique cultural hub. This microcosmic city within a city flourished up until the mid-20th century, when it was suddenly erased from Trenton's map by urban renewal. This is the story of a group of people who lived together in a prosperous community for many years and then disappeared, leaving behind only stories and photographs to remind them of their experiences in this culturally vibrant area. This is a story of race, of changing political atmosphere, of urban renewal, and the social, political, and economic forces that United States cities faced in the years that followed World War II. This is the story of Trenton's lost city of Jewtown.
In Trenton, you had a lot of ethnic communities, a border, an almost tangible border between these two neighborhoods that were so different on Market Street, where the new wave of immigrants was coming in and settling.
There were 7,000 Jews in Trenton, according to the 1930 census. 3,500 of them lived in the 3rd and 4th Ward, which made up the Jewtown area. But they were by no means the only people who lived in that area. It was an immigrant neighborhood. There were blacks, there were Hispanics, but predominantly there were Jews. People who I talked to about Jewtown would tell me that you could get anything you wanted in Jewtown. There were stores, there were at least 7 or 8 kosher butchers there. There were non-kosher butchers. There was a slaughterhouse there. There were all kinds of automotive stores, tire stores, junk stores. There were, basically you could get anything you wanted there. And there were great restaurants. There were bakeries right on Market Street. People talked about the smells as they walked down the street, that, you know, there were these wonderful smells.
The Jews of Trenton were not just known for their unique and popular businesses. They also had a reputation for serving their communities.
So the Jews started social organizations and social welfare organizations to take care of the Jews. There was the Hebrew Free Loan Association. One of the stories that I heard about the Hebrew Free Loan Association was that at one point, I think in the 40s and 50s, they ran into trouble with the IRS, who couldn't believe that they were lending money to other people with no interest, that was against the law. There were all kinds of Jewish social organizations, institutions that took care of the Jews, but part of Judaism has always had a social welfare component to it.
A look at the present-day Jewtown area would indicate that no such town exists, at least not anymore. Where this micro-city once flourished now stands the Richard J. Hughes Justice Complex, one of the many major state urban renewal projects from the late 1960s.
Eventually, of course, the whole area was torn down. State buildings now, not a single trace of that old, distinctive neighborhood. I don't know if there's a synagogue left in Trenton. People of Truth Synagogue, I believe it is, here in Newtown, has moved over from Trenton. It originated in that Market Street area.
Trenton, like a lot of industrial cities, entered a period of decline in the middle decades of the century, and this was primarily a process of losing manufacturing. As we move into the 50s, 60s, 70s, Trenton enters a crisis moment when there simply are not the jobs that there used to be.
Trenton was a city of workers. The city of Trenton really started to decline when the jobs moved out of Trenton, when Roebling moved out, when the potteries moved out. that's when the city started to die, when the good-paying jobs moved out.
Urban renewal was really an effort after World War II to remake northern and midwestern cities. I'd say cities that were predominantly industrial cities. And so, the effort took many different forms to kind of clear what had been deemed slums or blighted areas, and remake those spaces with often public buildings, public uses, highways, government buildings, cultural centers.
Urban renewal loomed on the horizon for Trenton's Jewtown residents in the 50s and 60s. But urban renewal itself is not the reason Trenton's Jews left the city. In fact, the Jews left the city long before, thanks to a new ally they had found in post-war America.
The Jewish American experience in the middle decades is really, it's a really dramatic story of change. So before World War II, we know that about 3% of Jewish Americans were in the professions. And as we move deeper into the 40s, 50s, certainly by the early 60s, close to 23% of Jewish Americans are in the professions. They had faced their own discrimination, but after the war, a lot of that discrimination starts to fade away, largely because of the horror of the Holocaust.
The Jews had the choice. If they chose opportunity. If you have the choice between opportunity and oppression, you choose opportunity. So the Jews took advantage of the opportunity and moved out of town, moved into areas that they couldn't originally move to, and thus left a void.
You did not have any more the reason for gathering together as a solid group. There was no persecution. You were accepted pretty much everywhere. It's, I guess, just a little microcosm of what happens to, I guess, almost all of the groups who come here to this country. Generations succeed generation, and they get more prosperous. They move into the larger community, not huddling together in groups, and becoming less and less ethnically identifiable, I guess.
They saw the handwriting on the wall, and they started moving into areas that they couldn't move into, that their parents couldn't move into.
The culture was not adaptable to the American, to the American way of life. It was a culture that had evolved in an entirely different atmosphere.
In order for historians to understand any single event, they must attempt to understand the full scope of external and contemporaneous events surrounding a point of inquiry. In the case of Trenton's Jewtown, the story of race is foundational.
When I grew up, Trenton was a very, very segregated town. It was not at that time illegal, but there was a gentleman's agreement. The banks would not loan money to black people who wanted to buy in a white neighborhood. The insurance companies wouldn't write insurance on their houses. It was just here's where the black people were, as if there was a fence. It was literally a ghetto.
The GI Bill is really so essential to understanding suburbanization. I would say because the mortgage benefits that were made available to veterans returning from service at the end of the war, those benefits, officially were open to veterans of any race, whites, blacks. The reality on the ground was something quite different. This is one of the challenges that black veterans and their families faced. It was very difficult for them to get these loans, these mortgages, to buy in the suburbs. In contrast, white ethnics, be they Catholic, Protestants, or Jews who served in the war, were able to take full advantage. I mean, it's just essential to understanding what becomes a kind of defining pattern of the mid-20th century.
The factories closed. The jobs were no longer there. The black people moved into the white neighborhoods, not aggressively, but because there was places for sale. The factory closes and somebody's got to move somewhere else because there are no jobs, and he's going to sell his house to whoever can buy it.
Critics claimed that urban renewal often translated into Negro removal, and certainly that was the case in Trenton. We have examples of that in New York as well, and other cities, where black communities were defined as blighted and among the first to be cleared. This also comes into play with Jewish communities.
The people were suddenly free to buy wherever they could find a willing seller. And it was no longer legal for the insurance companies to discriminate and the banks. It just fell apart.
Urban renewal eventually came for Jewtown. The shops relocated to the suburbs long before the state leveled these neighborhoods.
Jewtown was on its demise before, if you will, the white flight of after the riots of '67. And I think by then, pretty much, it was over for Jewtown.
Urban renewal met little to no resistance from the Jewish population, who were content with their newfound opportunities in suburbia.
I don't recall anybody saying, no, we don't want to do that.
I'm not sure there were enough people to feel like they were pushed out. I think a lot of the Jews had made their decision to move out before that.
Urban renewal as an idea was well-meaning, but in terms of the application, urban renewal presented a much harsher reality for the future of the city.
I would understand it as a way for cities to respond to the kind of dual pressures of deindustrialization, but also suburbanization. So as so many people are moving out of city centers, cities are trying to remake themselves. And there's a kind of internal logic that often makes sense in the minds of people like Robert Moses in New York or Mayor Holland in Trenton. But years later, we can look back and see that often these efforts are misguided.
The state had tunnel vision for urban renewal. Mayor Holland saw the opportunity to achieve two goals at once by tearing down black neighborhoods and building middle-class housing, all in an attempt to bring back Trenton's fleeing white population.
You know, Mayor Holland, who was in office in the 60s and was someone who was really wrestling with these questions of how to bring the city back, how to bring middle-class people back into the city. One of his experiments was the Kingsbury Towers in the South Ward, just south of downtown. And these stand today, two exposed concrete towers. They were originally designed to attract middle-class residents. And yet, at the time, they were slated to be built on top of what was the black neighborhood. So much of that South Ward, kind of south of downtown and then going towards the river, was home to African American communities. And often these communities were defined as slums or blighted areas so that they could be cleared in the name of urban renewal.
I think urban renewal was inevitable, but I don't think that the way it was handled made when so much the government land, the state government got so much of the land, and it totally destroyed the tax base of Trenton. You need to have jobs in the city. You need to have people paying taxes in the city. And I think if you look at what's plagued Trenton today, the city is starved for tax dollars, and it's hard to attract people to live in a city.
But in retrospect, these decisions seem misguided because they're less focused on the community that was already living in the city. often, and this is true not just in Trenton, but often urban renewal projects tend to privilege white suburban interests that are often kind of car focused, and yet we're at a moment now where we need to move beyond that to look at the interests of people living in the city, and what it could mean to have a walkable green space by the river again, like we used to have.
Urban renewal effectively suffocated any potential room for economic growth in Trenton. Local businesses were relocated, the highway cut off the city from the waterfront, and the cultural centers for minority groups such as Trenton's Jews were erased from the map. The legacy of Jewtown now lives on in boxes at the Trenton Free Public Library. Several blogs and social media groups have been formed for the sake of reminiscing and sharing images about Jewtown's past. But in most cases, nostalgia is the extent of Jewtown's legacy. Urban renewal erased any concrete symbols of the past that may have attracted outside attention to this area, condemning the memory to boxes and blogs. While the Jewish experience in Trenton echoes the Jewish experience on the national level in many ways, Jewtown's experience was unique in its interconnectedness to the legacy of other minority groups in the city, as well as the nature of its demise. The legacy of Jewtown cannot be understood without the broader contexts of changes in government policy, racial tension, social mobility, white flight, urban renewal, and the motivations and goals of those who facilitated urban renewal. There will probably never be anything quite like Jewtown again, but the legacy it left behind will always be remembered.